All right, I want to read the end of the prologue to The Mark of the Sacred by Jean-Pierre Dupuy. Here he sets up kind of the thesis of the book. It's just a couple of pages, which will set up the first chapter here. Okay, so the arguments that I present in this book grow out of my struggle for more than 30 years now to come to grips with the thought of René Girard. I shall say nothing about it for the moment, except this. In reviving a long tradition of religious anthropology interrupted by the Second World War and the decades of structuralism and deconstructionist post-structuralism that followed, Girard renewed inquiry into the origins of culture. Like Durkheim, Mauss, Freud, Fraser, Hocart, and many other social theorists before him, he considers that culture arose in conjunction with the notion of the sacred. Girard's hypothesis, as he calls it, asserts that the sacred was produced by a mechanism of self-exaltation, so that violence, in projecting itself beyond the domain of human control by means of ritual practices and systems of rules, prohibitions, and obligations, became self-limiting. On this view, the sacred is identified with a good form of institutionalized violence that holds in check bad anarchic violence. The desacralization of the world that modernity brought about is built upon a kind of knowledge, or suspicion perhaps, that gradually insinuated itself in human thinking. The suspicion that good and bad violence are not opposites, but actually one and the same, that at bottom there is no difference between them. How then did this suspicion make its way into our minds? Girard's reply, which I shall consider in due course, poses in its turn a prior question that I'm not quite sure how to answer. How can there be knowledge of self-transcendence without true transcendence? Be that as it may, it cannot be denied that this suspicion, this knowledge, is now ours. We know that Satan casts out Satan, as the Bible says. We know that evil is capable of self-transcendence, and by virtue of just this, capable of containing itself within limits, and so on, too, of averting total destruction. The most striking illustration, which I shall discuss at length in the last chapter, is to be found in the history of the decades since the beginning of the Cold War. Throughout this period, it has been as though the bomb protected us from the bomb, an astonishing paradox that some of the most brilliant minds have sought to explain with only partial success. The very existence of nuclear weapons, it would appear, has prevented the world from disappearing in nuclear holocaust. That evil should have contained evil is therefore a possibility, but plainly it is not a necessity, as the nuclear case shows with unimprovable clarity. The question is no longer, why has an atomic war not taken place since 1945? Now the question has become, when will it take place in the future? If this much is admitted, it follows that the powerlessness of contemporary rationalism in its many forms to apprehend the nature of self-transcendence is identical with the denial that lies at its very heart, the refusal to accept that the ways of thinking it authorizes are rooted in our experience of the sacred. I have cast this book in the form of a metaphysical and theological detective story, after the example of two masterpieces of the genre to whose authors, it goes without saying, I do not dare compare myself, quote the approach to Almaltism by Jorge Luis Borges, and The Sign of the Broken Sword by G.K. Chesterton. The objects of my investigations are indications, traces, signs. Taken together, they are the mark of the sacred that appears in texts, analyses, and arguments pretending to be founded on the human reason alone, on scientific rationality and nothing else. This mark of the sacred assumes any number of guises, which are so many deformations of the pure figure of self-transcendence as I have just tried to describe it. These deformations are due to error, of course, but not to just any error. It is because the various forms of rationalism I examine deny having any relationship at all to the sacred that they cannot help but reflect it. Only they do so in a distorted fashion that is often illogical and self-contradictory. It may be wondered how the sacred reveals itself when it structures a text in which it nowhere figures as a thematic element. The question already arises in connection with religious texts proper, such as myths. A mythic hero is expelled from a city, for example, for having destroyed the foundations of the political order. But the account of this expulsion transforms this event into the foundation of the very same political order. This paradoxical loop, how is it possible to have destroyed a social order that one creates by being expelled from it? It is the very signature of myth. Rousseau's political philosophy is based on precisely this same strange loop, as we have already seen, since the social contract, in order to be entered into, must already have been entered into. Or again, in many mythic accounts, fate implacably unwinds until the moment of a final catastrophe is reached. But in order for it to be fulfilled, an accident must occur. The accident is not the same as fate. Indeed, in a sense, it is its opposite. But it is the indispensable insurmount of fate, a supplement of fate, in the sense that Derrida gives this term. The effectiveness of nuclear deterrence, for example, is a consequence of rational reliance on paradoxical account of this type. And yet another example, if one is really needed, is it better than one innocent man should die so that an entire people and nation will not perish? The high priest Caiaphas' decision to turn Jesus over to Pilate, or rather the revulsion at this decision that caused Christianity to branch off from Judaism, forms the core of the most influential moral and political doctrine of the 20th century, the theory of justice developed by Rawls, which claims to depend on the resources of rationality alone. In what follows, I shall demonstrate that the irreducibility of the paradoxical logic of the sacred by considering 5 different spheres of contemporary rationality. Transhumanism, which expresses mankind's urge to go beyond itself by means of science and technology. Evolutionism, which uses Darwin's theory to account for the persistence and the insistence of religion. Electoralism, or the introduction of numerical calculation into the rituals of politics. Economism, which is to say the claim that economics is a normative science capable of resolving, among other things, the question of social justice. And catastrophism, whose morbid outlook informs the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. At once the most rational and the most insane idea that humanity has ever conceived. One figure in particular has captured my imagination: the unfolding of self-transcendence in time. Baron Munchausen's feat finds its counterpart in this when a community of people is pulled forward by an image of the future that it has projected in front of itself, an image that, once overtaken by events, becomes a part of reality. Humanity has sometimes managed to achieve this same feat, not only in its moments of greatest glory, but in the most tragic moments of its history as well. The present work was written in the shadow cast by the catastrophic future that seems today to be our destiny. This apocalyptic perspective makes it at once possible, urgent, and necessary that we grasp the most fundamental of human truths, namely that it is the sacred that has made us who and what we are. Otherwise, we shall be incapable of recognizing the desacralization of the world brought about by modernity for what it is, an unprecedented train of events that threatens to strip us of all protection against our own violence, and so to lead us directly to the final catastrophe. But this same train of events, if only we can fathom its true character in the time that is left to us, may also point the way to a radically different world than the one we know today, in which religion will have taken the place of sacred. I have also conceived the present work as a sort of logbook in which I record the stages of my own intellectual development, the path by which I have come to think as I do today. This is why I have wished to begin with an account of my earliest influences, not omitting certain quite personal details. For the same reason, I have chosen to end the book with an epilogue that takes the form of a confession, a bearing of the soul. The figure of self-transcendence, or as I should now say, bootstrapping, is illustrated not only by the computer, it is embodied in another marvel of engineering, the suspension bridge. Spanning the entrance to a bay, the roadway rises gracefully over the water, supported by cables suspended from high towers. The vertical thrust of the towers derives from their own weight. Gravity has been converted into upward momentum. The most beautiful of the world's suspension bridges, the Golden Gate, watches over San Francisco Bay. It was there, in the immediate vicinity of the bridge, that 2 persons attached themselves to an image they had projected outside of themselves, an image that shattered and fell into pieces around them the moment they tried to make it a reality. Theirs was an impossible love, a tragedy of failed self-transcendence, swallowed up by the black hole of nothingness. The story of this love is told by Alfred Hitchcock's absolute masterpiece, Vertigo. Hitchcock's film is for me what Sophocles' tragedy Oedipus Rex was for Hölderlin and Girard, the womb from which I am issued. I pay tribute to it in conclusion. So that is the end of the prologue. Next chapter is chapter 1, Imagining the End, starring a catastrophe. Thanks for listening.